In this video, we'll discuss autonomic nervous system. Few important exam questions before we discuss the topic. Question number 1. Which postganglionic sympathetic fibers secrete acetylcholine? Number 2. Which organ does not have postganglionic sympathetic fibers? Number 3. Where dopamine is produced in the sympathetic nervous system? And number 4. Which organ has longest preganglionic sympathetic fibers? Now, autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is a part of the peripheral nervous system that is connected to the central nervous system by spinal nerves, cranial nerves, brainstem, and hypothalamus. So ANS, autonomic nervous system, is the peripheral nervous system which is connected to the CNS via the spinal nerves, cranial nerves, brainstem, and hypothalamus, which is also known as head ganglion. Stimulation of the anterior superior hypothalamus produces parasympathetic responses, and the stimulation of the dorsomedial and posterior hypothalamus produces sympathetic response, which also increases norepinephrine and epinephrine production in rage, fear, and emotional distress. So this is the role of hypothalamus in the autonomic nervous system, that stimulation of anterior superior part produces parasympathetic response, and stimulation of dorsomedial and posterior part produces sympathetic responses, which also increases norepinephrine and epinephrine in rage, fear, and emotional distress. Autonomic nervous system functions automatically and involuntarily and has two parts: sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. This I have colored in different colors. The sympathetic nervous system is in orange color and parasympathetic nervous system is colored green. Both sympathetic and parasympathetic system have preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. See here, this is green preganglionic fibers and then postganglionic. Similarly, in the sympathetic system, these are the preganglionic fibers and then the postganglionic fibers. The preganglionic neurons, as you see in this diagram, that they arise from the central nervous system, number 1, and number 2, they arise from intermediolateral gray horns of the spinal cord, and number 3, homologous cranial nerve nuclei. So these preganglionic fibers, they are arising from CNS, from intermediolateral gray horn of spinal cords, and the homologous cranial nerve nuclei. We'll discuss it later. And number 4, they are mostly myelinated and slow conducting B fibers. So this is where in the gray spinal cord and the homologous cranial nerve nuclei, where the preganglionic fibers of both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system arise. They are B-type of slow conducting fiber, and they synapse the postganglionic fibers arising from here, the postganglionic fibers, the second neuron cell body. Similarly, here in the sympathetic system, preganglionic fibers from lateral gray horn of the spinal cord to the paravertebral ganglia. We'll discuss it in a moment. Whereas postganglionic neurons are outside the CNS. Number 2, they are unmyelinated C-type of fibers. And number 3, postganglionic sympathetic nerves arise from the paravertebral and prevertebral ganglia. Here the paravertebral ganglia parallel to the spinal cord, and these are prevertebral ganglia of the sympathetic. So they are unmyelinated fiber, the postganglionic fibers, and that of the postganglionic sympathetic are paravertebral and prevertebral and pass to the viscera at the target organ. Whereas the postganglionic parasympathetic ganglia, these are the green colored ganglia, are parasympathetic ganglia from where the postganglionic parasympathetic fibers arise. These ganglia are close to or in the vicinity of the organ they supply. The sympathetic nervous system cell bodies lie in the lateral gray column of the spinal cord, where thoracic 1 to lumbar 3 vertebra. So it's known as thoracolumbar outflow. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system arises from the craniosacral outflow from 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th cranial nerve, and the sacral 3rd and 4th nerve. So these are the sympathetic fiber arising from thoracic 1 to lumbar 3, and the parasympathetic fiber arise from midbrain and brainstem wire through the cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, 7, facial, 9, glossopharyngeal, and 10th vagus. And it has a second part, the parasympathetic sacral. So it's called craniosacral outflow, sacral 2, 3, and 4. The preganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic system are long, and that of the sympathetic system are short, because these paravertebral ganglia are close to the spinal cord, whereas these ganglia are in the organ which they supply in the parasympathetic nervous systems, whereas the postganglionic fibers of the sympathetic system are long. But the exception to this in the sympathetic system is that of the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla has lost postganglionic fiber. It only has preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic system. It's not shown here, that supplies the gland, and the gland itself produces this secretion in the bloodstream. That's why it's an endocrine gland, and these are the prevertebral ganglia of the sympathetic system. So there are two types of ganglia in the sympathetic system: the paravertebral, parallel to the spinal cord, and the prevertebral ganglia in front of the spinal cord or the vertebral column. Now the paravertebral gang, which is known as thoracolumbar part, it has three cervical. Cervical is shown in blue. No sympathetic nerve arrive from the cervical part, but the cervical ganglia are formed by the upper thoracic sympathetic nerve. So I have shown it in a blue. Three cervical ganglia, pyramidal and inferior, and then they have 12 thoracic and 3 lumbar. The three cervical sympathetic ganglia, they supply the head region. Their fibers arise from the upper thoracic and postganglionic. These are the postganglionic fibers which supply organ in the head, and also from the upper thoracic, the postganglionic sympathetic fibers also supply heart and lung in the chest, whereas the middle thoracic fibers lay in the prevertebral. The three prevertebral ganglia are celiac, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric. Parasympathetic ganglia, these are green colored structures which are close to or in the vicinity of the organ they supply. The cranial nerve 3 oculomotor, which arises from the midbrain, it relays in the ciliary ganglion and supplies the pupilloconstrictor fiber. The pupillodilator fiber arises from the cervical sympathetic ganglion. So the pupil is constricted by stimulation of the parasympathetic nerve, the oculomotor nerve, and dilated by the sympathetic nerve fibers from the superior sympathetic ganglion. And the pterygopalatine ganglion is formed by facial nerve, 7 cranial nerve, and also the mandibular ganglion, and they supply the lacrimal gland and the salivary gland, whereas the 9th cranial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, relays in the otic ganglion and supplies secretomotor fibers to the parotid, and the vagus supplies the chest and the organs in the abdomen, and its ganglia are in the vicinity of the organ they supply. It supplies heart, lung in the chest and in the abdomen, intestine, pancreas, liver, kidney, and all the other organs. And the sacral part, sacral 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, they supply the large intestine, kidney, uterus, urinary bladder, and sex organ and external genitalia. So this was the supply of sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So I already explained sympathetic nerve fibers to the head arise from the upper thoracic paravertebral region and relay in the superior, middle, and inferior cervical ganglia. The middle thoracic fibers, they don't relay in the paravertebral gang. Instead, they relay in the prevertebral gang and supply foregut and midgut structure. The lower thoracolumbar fibers, they synapse in the prevertebral ganglia and they supply large intestine, kidney, other abdominal structures, uterus. Fibers that supply the sympathetic fibers, the uterus, they have long desynaptic fibers and short postsynaptic fibers which arise from the thoracic 10 to lumbar 2. They are long and pass through the hypogastric ganglion, relay in the pelvic ganglion close to the uterus. Now, parasympathetic nervous system, as I already discussed, cranial nerve 3 relays in ciliary ganglion close to the eye. Cranial nerve 7 have 2 ganglion, pterygopalatine and submandibular. Pterygopalatine ganglion supply lacrimal gland and oral and nasal mucosa, and a submandibular ganglion submandibular and sublingual gland, whereas cranial nerve 9 glossopharyngeal relays in the otic ganglion and supply parotid gland. The vagus nerve passes through to the thorax and abdominal region and innervate its structure and has the ganglia close to the structure that it supplies. Here the vagus nerve supply heart, lung, GI, large intestine, kidney, and other organs. And now physiological of sympathetic and parasympathetic. Physiological responses of both systems are, so when sympathetic system causes activation, parasympathetic is inhibitory in this case, but it's not always the case because both systems may be active at the same time. Like in the muscle relaxation and sphincter contraction. When the muscle relaxes, sphincter contract at the same time. Now the effects on the GI. The sympathetic system decreases the peristalsis in the GIT and salivary and GI and decreases digestion. Whereas parasympathetic system increases peristalsis, motility, and increases pancreatic secretion and the GI and increases the digestion. So that is why the mouth gets dry in situations of emergency, flight, and privation. So the salivary and decrease. And the muscle relaxation, as I already told, sympathetic causes muscle relaxation and sphincter contraction, whereas parasympathetic causes muscle contraction and sphincter relaxation. So the muscles of the gallbladder, urinary bladder, and the GI, they are relaxed by the sympathetic system and they are contracted, whereas the sphincter are constricted by the sympathetic system and relaxed when the parasympathetic is. And in the blood vessels, the arterioles get constriction by sympathetic and dilatation by the parasympathetic system. The action on the heart and its contractility. Sympathetic system, generally speaking, increases the heart rate and contractility, and the parasympathetic decrease. But let's discuss the different types of adrenergic sympathetic receptors. Here I'll discuss briefly. Alpha 1 receptors are postsynaptic and they cause vasoconstriction. Alpha 1 agonists cause vasoconstriction and increase the blood pressure, whereas alpha 2 receptors are presynaptic and they cause negative feedback control and they inhibit the noradrenaline release. So here it is, acting on the heart. The presynaptic receptors are alpha 2 and they control the negative feedback control, inhibit the sympathetic system. They are sympatholytic. The alpha 2 agonists therefore are sympatholytic and they will decrease the blood pressure. The beta 1 stimulation, they are in the heart, cardioselective, and they increase rate and force of contraction. And in the kidney, the beta 1 stimulation increases the renin production and increases the blood pressure. Whereas beta 2 receptors are in the heart, lung, liver, GIT, uterus, and vascular smooth and skeletal muscle, and their stimulation causes vasodilation and bronchodilation. And the third beta receptors, the beta 3 receptors, are adipose and they cause lipolysis and they cause weight loss. Now the action on the bronchial tree, sympathetic causes dilatation and parasympathetic causes constriction of the bronchi. And on the pupil, sympathetic system dilates and the parasympathetic constrict. It is the cervical sympathetic ganglion that sends the postganglionic sympathetic fibers to the pupil, and the ciliary ganglion, ciliary muscle of the lens, sympathetic system relaxes them and causes far vision possible and accommodation, whereas parasympathetic causes ciliary muscle contraction and facilitates the closure vision. And in the sexual function, sympathetic system causes ejaculation and parasympathetic system causes erection, controlled by sacral second to sacral fourth. In the adrenal medulla, it produces adrenaline, but the presynaptic terminal produces acetylcholine, and adrenal medulla is the sympathetic ganglion that has lost postganglionic nerve, and acetylcholine presynaptic secretomotor fibers stimulate produce adrenaline directly in the bloodstream. Now neurotransmitters of the autonomic nervous, mainly two neurotransmitters are produced in the ANS. They are acetylcholine and noradrenaline. Number 1, acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is produced at all preganglionic neurons, both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves, and number 2, it's produced at all postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is the ganglia of parasympathetic where acetylcholine is produced, and these are also the sympathetic ganglia where acetylcholine is produced. So it's produced on both the sympathetic ganglia of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and it's produced at all postganglionic parasympathetic nervous system. Also, acetylcholine is produced at the postganglionic sympathetic fibers, not shown here, of the sweat gland. So postganglionic sympathetic fibers of the sweat gland, and number 2, postganglionic sympathetic fibers of the blood vessels that supply the skeletal muscle, which cause vasodilatation. So acetylcholine is produced at the preganglionic neuron in both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and the postganglionic neuron of parasympathetic nervous system, and in the sympathetic nervous system it is produced in the postganglionic sympathetic fibers of the sweat gland and postganglionic sympathetic fibers of the blood vessels in the skeletal muscle. Now noradrenaline is produced at the postganglionic sympathetic fiber. Number 2, adrenal medulla is a sympathetic ganglion that has lost postganglionic nerve and has acetylcholine secretomotor fibers and stimulate to produce adrenaline directly in the blood. So noradrenaline at all postganglionic sympathetic nerves and adrenaline at adrenal medulla which does not have postganglion fiber. Now answers to the question number 1. Which postganglionic sympathetic fibers secrete acetylcholine? Postganglionic sympathetic nerves to the sweat gland, they secrete acetylcholine, and number 2, postganglionic sympathetic nerve to the blood vessel and they must produce acetylcholine. Otherwise, noradrenaline is produced at all postganglionic nerve. Question number 2. Which organ does not have postganglionic sympathetic ganglion? Adrenal medulla that has lost the postganglionic sympathetic ganglion and secrete adrenaline. So adrenal medulla does not produce noradrenaline, it produces adrenaline. Question 3. Where dopamine is produced in the sympathetic nervous system? Dopamine is produced at the interneuron in the ganglion, and it's a D2 receptor that produces inhibitory postsynaptic potential, and preganglionic acetylcholine produce excitatory postsynaptic potential. Question Question number 4. Which organ has longest preganglionic sympathetic fibers? Preganglionic sympathetic fibers to the uterus arise from 10th thoracic to 2nd lumbar and are long and pass through the hypogastric ganglion and relay in the pelvic ganglion close to the uterus.